Speaking of women's cricket, the Women's Ashes wash up. I must admit, I haven't seen much of the test other than the highlights. And I listened to your and Izzy's episodes, and the difficulties that England experienced in the field. I didn't think it was interesting watching back. I don't think the drop catch thing. I was expecting them all to be like absolute sitters. I didn't realise that a lot of them were kind of half chances and whatnot. But still, like, it adds up, and it paints a wider picture when a team's already
enough of them were sitters.
Yeah.
There were enough absolute straightforward ones.
And then Claire Connor speaking yesterday, I listened in on her press conference, which was a lengthy one at that, with the English press referring to the fact that there's a review coming. It'll process, and it's quite standard, right? There's always a review when you lose a major series, but they kind of had a review after the World Cup, so this is like folding on the review they did late last year when not making the elimination stage of that tournament. You can tell she's devastated. Like, you can tell they're all devastated. It's not. It's just totally natural to feel flat in this way. But it reinforces that this gap is growing to Australia, this again coming back to something that Brady wrote yesterday, that sometimes Australia feel like the Brazil of cricket. Like, no matter what the circumstances, they seemingly are the most formidable team in the world across formats, or depending on what time of the cycle. It's very unusual that Australia aren't there and thereabouts towards the top in men's cricket, and in women's cricket, the gap is just gigantic and getting bigger. So as far as how that plays out for England, it's going to be a review in the next few weeks, and presumably quite a lot of personnel change.
Probably. It's interesting. Heather Knight said she would think about it basically, but not right away, and try to make a decision when things were a bit more calm, which seems reasonable. I mean, I think when you've got a captain coming into their 9th year in the job, and Heather Knight's someone that I have a high regard for, but there have been results problems with this team. For a while, they've been losing bilateral games to teams that they should be able to beat with the resources they have, New Zealand and Sri Lanka and so on. They lose the semi-final at the T20 World Cup, and then their response to that is to come over here and get absolutely hammered. And this is, like, England have been pretty competitive in most of the last Women's Ashes series. They've been able to get into series, not in 2019, but in the other three of the last 4. They've been able to, they've drawn a couple of them. They nearly won that test in Canberra last time they were out here. So it was very different on those other occasions. So I think that's a couple of years with Heather Knight in charge, where two things to note. There aren't any other obvious leadership candidates who've developed under her. That's one thing to look at, is that, if you're doing a job as a leader, you want to be developing whoever's next, whereas it's just seemed to be assumed that, Siva Brunt is their best player, so she'll probably captain next. She probably shouldn't captain next, because she probably should be allowed to concentrate on being their best player. But there has to reach a point where you go, well, as captain, you mustn't be getting through to players anymore if you've been there for a long time and the results are declining in the way they have. And maybe it would be a mercy for Heather Knight, to get to just be the senior pro for however many years she wants to continue to play, and actually get the best out of herself as a batter, because she is still one of their best players. So, but I think I take a harder line with John Lewis, with the coach, who has said some absolutely absurd things. Obviously, everyone made fun of him for Australians grow up on the beach, and so they're just naturally healthier and more athletic. Well, and if that's the case, as Emma John wrote, if that's the case, well, why show up? Because you can never beat Australia because they went swimming when they were kids. The point is, these are professional cricketers, some of whom have been playing for England for 10, 12, 15 years. And they haven't been professional for that entire time, but they've been professional for long enough, the best part of a decade now, where they've been paid to train and to play and get better. You cannot use your upbringing as an excuse. That is absolute nonsense. You're a professional player. You're supposed to be honing and refining those skills. That is all of your job, is to get better at playing the sport that you play. So that aspect was nonsense from Lewis. And the stuff that he said after the test match is almost worse. They talked to him about the review. He said, "We review everything all the time. We reflect and we try and grow the team in the sport. Just to do it after every away Ashes series is probably not the right way to do it." John, the last couple of away Ashes series have been competitive. A couple of series before that, England won over here. They haven't done one after every away Ashes series because they've played to a competent standard. you've been whitewashed. You've been beaten across 3 formats every time you've stepped on the field. Your fielding's been terrible. You've dropped catches across every match that you've played across the series. Like, you've been so far below the standard. It's just absolute deflecting nonsense to say that, oh, well, we shouldn't overreact, And then he went on to say he was the man for the future. Had real Darren Lehman in Cape Town energy, saying, oh, we've got young players that have played. I feel I haven't finished the job. The results haven't gone the way we want them, but I'm committed, and I feel like I'm the right guy to do it. You're clearly not. And clearly the staff around you aren't, if you haven't been able to get basics out of your players. If you'd lost games while actually hitting the boxes for the ticking the boxes for the basics that you need to do, that would be one thing. But when it's been that incompetent just at the basic level of skills, then there's clearly a problem with the coaching setup. Like, some of this stuff out of the England camp is delusional. Even Heather Knight, who says it's just the phrasing. We unfortunately haven't played our best cricket here. Like, say what happened. Say what it was. Say we were dreadful. We got smashed. We were badly outplayed. Like, be willing to confront things, because there's this tendency to want to make everything nice and to be not confrontational in the England camp, and it's just a recipe for mediocrity, and that's what they've delivered.
Look, it's because the gap is so big between the countries. At least it has been in this series. 16-0 feels like it might have happened if you played this series a number of times in a row, right? Like, at some level, this goes to Australia being so much better. It's a bit like when...
Yeah, but they're allowed to be better. It doesn't mean you can't take catches. It doesn't mean you can't stop balls in the field,
Yeah, no, I understand that. But I'm not trying to make excuses but oftentimes teams towards the end, when they've been thrashed in a series, the last game of the run will end up being a schmozzle, right? We know that.
But all the games were like that. This is my point.
Yeah.
They dropped catches and misfielded across every match of the series, all 7. They were dreadful in the field in every game.
So the question that was put to Claire, and what she was talking about yesterday, was the playing under pressure piece to this, because there's a huge difference in the pressure between most series that England play in, because most series England play in, they are the ones who are embarrassing whoever's rocking up in England, right? They're playing the Windies and flying them, or what, there's a lot of that happens, because the gap between teams in women's cricket can sometimes be magnified. The way they pummeled New Zealand last year is another example of that. And they did so well before Christmas in South Africa, which suggested they were on the way back, having had a really bad end to their World Cup. So, yeah, it's not a linear thing. Like, England's blotchy at the moment. And I think what you said there about who are the next generation leaders coming through, and something I said a couple of weeks ago, I think it was to you, Jeff, maybe it was on broadcast, but a lot of these cricketers will be quite knackered, and not just from like the last 6 months, but like structurally knackered. Like, they've been on the treadmill for
what we've talked about with that run from the World Cup, basically through all the leagues, WBBL. They're all going to India to play the WPL next.
That's right. So the demands on being a cricketer have increased. So I'm interested in how that might affect how long some of the players go around for. Now, they're financially incentivized to keep going around, but there's something about like being at your absolute sharpest, and there's a reason why most professional athletes have a window that's no more than about 10 years. It's very unusual to see more than 10 years. Well, some of them are into sort of year 14, 15, 16 of their career. Like Danny Wyatt's probably in that boat, right? Danny Wyatt probably made it
in 2010.
Oh, there you go. So this is their 15th, 16th year of international cricket.
Yep.
And that doesn't mean her ceiling doesn't remain very high. Like, she's done some incredible things for England in the last couple of years and been a match winner. But that day-to-day, I'm not sure. That's the bit that I'm interested in, and how they can find a way to regroup before the World Cup. Because if they do have the stench of death about them, trying to get their shit together before a 50-over World Cup later this year is going to be very difficult to do. So
that's exactly the thing. And I don't think that's going to happen at this rate. I think if you look at this team, you run through the options they have available. Knight, as we said, maybe should change out of captaincy and be able to concentrate. I think that Nat Sciver-Brunt looks like she's feeling the fatigue of carrying the burden of being the player for this side that she has to deliver for them to win games. So I don't think adding captaincy to that's going to help. But who else do you go to? And where do you go? What does the future look like? So Tammy Beaumont's there, 33 and a half years old, still playing pretty well most of the time, but she can't play T20 cricket. They basically don't like picking her because she doesn't score quickly enough. Danny Wyatt, like you say, 15, 16 years, but she's always, returns are middling, and they always have been. She has occasional dashing innings, but averages low 20s in all three formats. Amy Jones must have the worst match awareness of any cricketer I can remember seeing at a professional level. Like, it's extraordinary, some of the mistakes that she makes, particularly with batting. Her keeping's generally pretty good, but just the lack of paying any attention to the game. Alice Capsey's been doing some useful stuff with the ball and can whack the ball with the bat as well, but she blows hot and cold a bit, and she's not a good mover in the field, so there's that problem with mobility. They had Freya Kemp, who looked good here and there, and Danny Gibson, but they're the sort of all-rounders who can whack a few runs quickly, but they don't make more than a few. And then you've got Dunkley and Bouchier, and Dunkley, it feels like, has been around much longer than Bouchier, but they're basically the same age. They're both 26, and they're both at their best in 20-over cricket. They haven't found the recipe to be able to do it. That Dunkley test innings at Canberra aside, when she basically had to play a T20 innings, they haven't been able to make that happen across the longer form. So in terms of batting, where does England go? They don't have compelling options. Their bowling is the bit that looks in decent shape or better shape, where Rihanna McDonald-Gay was good. She tried hard and had a lot of determination and seemed to have a bit of a plan with the bat as well. Like, she didn't make a lot of runs, but she was sort of doing her best in that first innings when they were falling to bits. Lauren Bell was good when she wasn't bowling full tosses. Lauren Filer tries hard and tries to give it as much velocity as she can. But Eccleston's doing the job. She bowled 45 overs. So how is that a test strategy? We're going to have a spinner bowl 45 overs every test. What happens if she does a hamstring after 5 overs? Like, they don't have the breadth there either. Where are their other spin options? Charlie Dean can't do it because her batting's gone. Sarah Glenn was playing T20 domestic cricket in New Zealand rather than in the test squad. Like, I don't know. I just don't see where things improve for England, because there is a middling nature to most of the players they've got at their disposal.
Yeah, look, I understand what you're saying when you go through it line by line. It does, to me, at the same time, though, feel like when England's men have been thrashed, and this is sort of separate to your point, but I just want to say it anyway, is that when England's men get towed up in Australia, the funding levels that are directed the way of England's men aren't brought under question. You don't see people saying, well, should they really be allocating money to men's cricket because they've just been beaten soundly by Australia yet again in Australia? I've disliked the undercurrent of that conversation here that, because of course we're going into a quite substantial year in domestic cricket in England with the tiered system and the competitive process there, for which counties are getting those opportunities to go full professional, right? So it's a big year, right? 2025 for England women's cricket. And the debate, which you see plenty of online, about whether they should even be getting the funding levels that they're currently getting because they're not winning in Australia. And you can disregard it, of course.
That's not the point.
No, I know it's not the point. I'm absolutely separate to what you're saying, just to be clear about this. But it's more that I've been frustrated by that this has lent itself, because they've been beaten so badly this time, it's lent itself to the worst people getting the chance to use women's cricket as a piñata.
Totally.
I can see why.
It doesn't mean they shouldn't be getting funding. It just means that they should be living up to that. They should be doing better.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly it. So when the men got smashed in Australia in 21-22, there was a review, there was a change in personnel, and within 6 months they turned it around, because that's the nature of professional sport. Sometimes things get turned around quite quickly. Doesn't often take a lot. They might go to the 50-over World Cup with fresh leadership and they might win the bloody thing. That's the capricious nature of cricket. So we will follow that story closely as the review comes out. Just some other bits and pieces out of the women's test. Outstanding work from the MCG social media admin for bodying Mike Latham, who tried to make a joke about Annabelle Sutherland having her name put on the honours board and saying, where are the pronouns? They'll confuse them with her father, to which they wrote back to Latham that James's name starts with J and Annabelle's name starts with A, so how could they possibly get confused with the honours board, which was fucking delightful. And the honours board piece with Alana King as well, how she's been celebrated around the nation. Beautiful shots of her with her family watching her 5-wicket bag get put up on that home dressing room in Melbourne. Sometimes I think honours board stuff can be overplayed a little bit, but that was a really nice thing, seeing her name along with a whole bunch of people who we are conditioned to seeing up there winning Test matches for Australia on Boxing Day, or in Boxing Day week, and seeing Alana King and Annabelle Sutherland grouped with them. That was, again, just a little nod in the right direction. And look, I still think it was a mistake playing the Test at the MCG for the reasons that we spoke about a few weeks ago. However, they're the bits that make it worthwhile. That's the texture that makes it worthwhile, the parity with men. I think that it could have been a better spectacle had they played it elsewhere. But hey, maybe that's in the revision.
But they wouldn't have got 35,000 in 3 days at North Sydney Oval. They wouldn't have got 35,000 at the Junction.
Look, I mean, anyway, I don't want to get into this because it'll piss people off, and I haven't got the energy for that at the moment. But, the fact that even when expectations were being seriously managed, it was like, they might only get 20,000 there, they might only get 20, and then getting 12, having managed expectations about 20, then getting 12. It was an emblem to me that using the smaller venues and filling them with atmosphere still, I think, remains a better model than the cavernous MCG. But I balance that by saying that the Sutherland King moments were made more special because it was at the MCG. So it's a balancing act. It's not perfect. It's not perfect.
That's it.
But there's something that needs, if they're going to want to play, it's not a black and white situation, is what I think
it had to happen, and I think something like walking into the MCC library and seeing the scorecards that they'd put up of Peggy Antonio's game in January 1935 at the MCG, and the 6 for 49 that she took there, and getting to have that through line to the players of this generation playing this Test match here, I think that's special enough and significant enough and important enough that it outweighed the other considerations. So I'm glad that they did have it at the MCG, and it blew away the world record for a women's Test. It almost, it was 50% higher than the previous record, which was set across 5 days, and this was set across 3. So if they'd had a close game coming into day 4 and might have had another 15,000 in, you might have had 50,000 for the Test match if had England been good enough to actually provide the competitive tension. So, I think that worked out as well as it could have done.
Alyssa Healy's missing the Women's Premier League with this ongoing right foot injury. I know she played as the non-keeper in the series. 35 this year, Alyssa Healy, which has kind of crept up on me a little bit. I thought she might have been sort of earlier 30s. I guess there's never a perfect time, but in women's cricket, there's kind of always a perfect time to start thinking about the end, because there's so many World Cups and there's so many milestones like big series, women's Ashes, etc. Like, you couldn't rule it out. I mean, that article on Cricinfo at least hinted that might be the direction of travel. Yeah. World Cup this year, if she were to call it then, that would be perfectly reasonable. She's done literally everything one can do in the game.
Well, she has, and I think it's very, the feeling is very much that the kind of talk going around the MCG this week is that part of the reason they were so desperate to shoehorn her into the side was that this would be her last Test. So she hasn't announced that, but that's what we're picking up from the vibes, I guess, to try to get through to that 50-over World Cup in India and go out as a winner there, and then look to Generation Next, where Talia McGrath's been captaining as the deputy when required. But I'd love to see them give the chance to Ash Gardner to lead that side. Yeah, it's interesting. So, I spoke to a couple of players about that proposition probably 4 years ago, and it was put to me like that's a non-starter. Ash Gardner being captain of the Aussie team is a non-starter. I reckon that's changed now. I reckon that conversation's moved on. Interviewed her recently, and like she feels like such a senior player in that team. And so Ash Gardner, given she's cleared another hurdle in recent times, making her first 100 for Australia, more wickets, always dependable with the ball. She's clearly one of the first names on the team sheet, which is the type of person you want as captain. So Talia McGrath, who's done the job admirably before and stepped in a number of times. Put it this way, they've got great options all over the place when it comes to leadership in that Australian dressing room. Jeff, you were at the game at Junction Oval last week, the Afghanistan refugee women's team playing there in that really important and special day, and you documented that so nicely. Just some news at the back of that, the MCC, so the Marylebone version of the MCC and the MCC Foundation have launched since then a global refugee cricket fund. And that's been kickstarted with a donation of 100,000 quid from the ECB. And their initial focus is going to be raising money for the Pitch Our Future, which is the Australian-led program that
supports the Afghanistan women's team in exile in Australia. So money being funneled from the UK over to the Afghanistan women in Melbourne and Canberra,
Yep.
which is appreciated.
Yeah, it's good to have something tangible from the ECB, because we know that they've been in the fray at the ICC behind the scenes. We know that there have been stronger comments that we talked about over the last few weeks. Some of the public comments being made have been a bit punchier than they might have been in the past. And, Cricket Australia obviously put their money where their mouth is with staging the game, which meant that they put up all the players. They had accommodation for all of the Afghan players, the Melbourne players included, so that they could all stay together over the course of that couple of days, and so that they could have friends and family around. They invited them all to the big reception on day one at the MCG, so there were a lot of past Australian women's players there in that room as well, and a lot of dignitaries and high-ranking people, and so they were able to meet, the Afghan players were able to meet those Australian players and share stories, and it felt significant to give them a place at the centre of a major event in Australian cricket. So this is the ECB coming to the party, and hopefully they can keep banging the drum at the ICC and try to make the most of this first step to force there to be a second step and then a third step, however far those steps might take them.
Yeah, and it's reflective of the fact that there's like philanthropic money in cricket, which can sometimes be there to be funneled where it isn't getting via official channels. So the MCC Foundation seeing a chance to take some leadership here, and hopefully that's the catalyst for other philanthropic organisations in cricket to see this as a worthy pursuit. And the game at the Junction Oval was a great way to raise awareness of the plight of the Afghanistan women's team in exile, and so much good work has been done around that with publicising their travails. So, it felt like an important week, didn't it, on that front, that this isn't sort of an abstract theoretical thing. This is real human beings, real human being cricketers who have been caught in the crossfire. I mean, literally in some instances with their families, but certainly from becoming refugees as sports people. It must be a horrible situation, clearly a horrible situation. Jeff, before we go to our final break today, the women's under-19s final was held yesterday. India smashed South Africa, so they bowled them out for 82 and won by 9 wickets. So that, India have won both editions of this tournament. It reinforces that they are very much coming. But, good news that South Africa made the final, right? Like they beat Australia in the semi. India beat England in the other semi, which I doubt either of those two results would have been possible a generation ago. So, yes, we're so conditioned to having a conversation about Australia being by a mile the clubhouse leader in women's cricket right now. But, press fast forward 5 or 10 years and it's likely it'll feel like a very different world.
Well, it's been an interesting, curious tournament and a lot of low scores. The pitches in Selangor in Malaysia must have been conducive to some bowling at various times. But yeah, I suppose as far as echoes of history go, seeing South Africa get past Australia in a semi, whatever kind of World Cup it might be, is a little bit of relief, little bit of soothing there. But yeah, there were some erratic performances, which I can only assume must have been conditions related.
Yeah, I'd say so. We will try and get a readout of that tournament from Ben Jones at some point, who was working over there on broadcast once I'm back in London. Jeff, we'll take our last break. We'll return. We'll go over to India, where England's men have been playing, where Virat Kohli's been playing in the Ranji Trophy and some other domestic cricket as well. This is the Final Word Cricket Podcast. Adam Collins and Jeff Lemon. Why don't we start in the Ranji Trophy to the Arun Jaitley Stadium, the old Kotla, where Virat Kohli was playing in front of 15,000 people in his first Ranji Trophy game for about 15 years, since 2012, so 13 years. He missed out. He got bowled for 6, but whatever, no biggie there. It was it was reminded me of when Warney played that twos game coming back from the drug ban and we all piled into the Junction Oval, had that kind of energy about it. Seeing Kohli play a domestic game with his Indian helmet with some tape over the top of the Indian badge. It was absolutely perfect.
Classic. Absolutely classic. Real, state helmet at grade training kind of energy there. Pop the tape over the top. Not going to not going to bring another helmet, are you? I suppose that would be wasteful. Yes, so big crowd in. Maybe Kohli was just distracted looking at Gautam Gambhir's massive name on the big grandstand there and thinking about his coach as he got bowled for 6. But look, anything that gets people along to a Ranji game, I'm all for crowds at domestic tournaments. So what's the equivalent? How do we get anybody to a Shield game? How do you get more than 150 people to rock up to a state game in Australia?
We have days when we get more than 10,000 at Surrey, but I acknowledge that, it's a pretty good place to be.
Few and far between.
South London on a hot spring afternoon or whatever it is a pretty good pull factor. It did mean that Kohli was subject, because obviously there's lack of security, right? So it's harder to protect him in a domestic game. And all those guys running out and touching his feet. I mean, have some dignity, seriously. Running out and touching Kohli's feet.
Oh, it's very Christ-like, isn't it? It's because Jesus washes somebody else's feet. Whose feet does he wash? It's a sort of performance of humility, and then there's the Mary Magdalene thing of washing Christ's feet with her hair, which always seemed a bit OTT to me as well. Maybe it was just, they didn't have OnlyFans in the time of Christ, and so you couldn't get feet pics if that was your thing. You just had to go up close and personal with the real thing. So I don't know. Look, if Kohli ever needs an alternative revenue stream, get the old phone out, take some snaps of the old hoofs and put them up on the website. You'll get some sign-ups.